Hello, and thanks for stopping by. During his celebrated career, Charles Dickens wrote a number of Christmas stories, including The Chimes in 1844, The Cricket on the Hearth in 1845, and The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain in 1848. His first and by far most famous festive tale, however, is of course A Christmas Carol. Considering how it's rightly been regarded as a masterpiece since it first appeared way back in 1843, it may come as some surprise to learn that A Christmas Carol was written out of desperation. Dickens was already an established author by the early 1840s, having completed The Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, and Barnaby Rudge. In 1843, his latest book, The Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, was being serialised but unfortunately wasn't selling too well. As such, Charles Dickens' publishers, an outfit called Chapman and Hall, who are based at number 186 The Strand, were looking to decrease his monthly pay, which, considering he was already in debt whilst expecting a fifth child with his wife Catherine, posed something of a problem for the author. It was against this backdrop, in the autumn of 1843, that Charles Dickens sat down to write A Christmas Carol in the hope of making some quick money. He was 31 years old at the time. This miniature portrait, which was discovered in South Africa in 2018, dates from 1843 itself. As you can see, this fresh-faced young man presents a rather different view to the older, wiser, and heavily bearded image of Dickens to which we've become accustomed. It took Dickens just 6 weeks to complete the short novel. Chapman and Hall quickly had it printed, and 6,000 copies were made available in shops on the 19th of December. By Christmas Eve, this first batch had already sold out, earning Dickens £230, which is approximately £14,000 in today's money. If you'd like to get your hands on one of these rare early first editions, it's going to cost you. When they do come up for auction, they often go for tens of thousands of pounds. The book's popularity meant that within just a few weeks, a pirated copy had emerged, leading Dickens to take legal action. Although he won the case, Dickens found himself having to pay out £700 in legal costs after the guilty party, rather conveniently, declared themselves bankrupt. Despite the bitterness this episode caused for Dickens, it would later inspire him to write Bleak House, for example, A Christmas Carol has remained in print ever since and has become an integral part of the festive season. As with most of Dickens' work, A Christmas Carol promotes a strong moral message and is heavily inspired by the streets and characters he would encounter whilst walking around the metropolis. As such, there are a number of locations in the capital associated with the book. Some are very specific and mentioned by Dickens himself. Others are conjecture based upon some detective work. So, if you'd now like to join me, I shall take you on a tour of Scrooge's London. We'll begin in the churchyard of St Paul's Cathedral, which receives a mention in the very opening lines to A Christmas Carol. In the introduction, Dickens makes it crystal clear that Scrooge's business partner, Jacob Marley, is very much deceased. And to emphasise how important this is to the story, he compares the situation to the ghost of Hamlet's father. There is no doubt that Marley was dead, he tells us. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there'd be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night, in an easterly wind, upon his own ramparts, than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St Paul's churchyard for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. The figure at the centre of A Christmas Carol is of course the miserly businessman Ebenezer Scrooge. It's believed Dickens may have based this mean, tight-fisted grump on a real figure, one of the main contenders being John Elwes. Born into a wealthy family in London in 1714, Elwes inherited a fortune whilst he was still a youngster. He attended Westminster School, which is located beside Westminster Abbey, and he would later go on to become the Member of Parliament for Berkshire. However, despite his immensely privileged background, Elwes lived in a state of abject poverty as he refused to spend a single penny of his wealth. His clothes were so ragged he was often mistaken for a beggar, and he'd happily accept coins offered to him by those who took pity. Large holes in the roof of his mansion went unchecked, allowing rainwater to pour in, He'd climb into bed as soon as darkness fell, so as to avoid spending money on candles, and perhaps worst of all, he'd quite happily eat rotting food, including any dead animal he happened to find in the street. Although Scrooge isn't quite that bad, he doesn't lead an unnecessarily frugal existence, and this is reflected in his small, freezing cold counting house. The exact location of Scrooge's office isn't mentioned by Dickens, but using some detective work, we can take an educated guess. One thing we do know is that it's situated off of Cornhill, which is one of the financial district's main thoroughfares. And we know this because when Scrooge's put upon employee, Bob Cratchit, is finally permitted to leave work, Dickens tells us that he cheerfully slid up and down Cornhill 20 times, in honour of it being Christmas Eve. Charles Dickens also informs us that the ancient tower of a church with its gruff old bell can usually be seen from Scrooge's counting house, although on this Christmas Eve it is obscured by the fog and darkness. The most likely contender for the church is St Michael's Cornhill, seen here, which was founded in the 1130s. The current building, give or take a few alterations, dates from the 1670s. Directly opposite St Michael's is the cramped enclosed square known as Newman's Court, so maybe this is where you would have found Scrooge's counting house had you been traipsing around the streets of London in the 1840s. As the Christmas Eve afternoon draws on, Scrooge's cheerful nephew Fred pops by to wish his uncle a Merry Christmas, even though he knows the greeting won't be returned. Scrooge's long-suffering clerk, Bob Cratchit, however, is more than happy to return Fred's Christmas wishes, to which Scrooge responds, "My clerk with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas? I'll retire to Bedlam." Bedlam is the popular shortened name for the Bethlem Royal Hospital, which during Dickens' time housed patients suffering from mental health disorders. It was founded in the 13th century and, as I'm sure you can imagine, was a brutal institution for many, many years. The Bethlem Royal Hospital has had several homes over the centuries. It's currently located in Bromley. In 1843, when A Christmas Carol was first published, you would have found it in Lambeth in a grand purpose-built complex which opened in 1815. You can still see this building today. It now houses the Imperial War Museum. Located on Bank Junction, the Mansion House is the official residence of the Lord Mayor of London. This post is not to be confused with the Mayor for the wider London area, who's currently Sadiq Khan, which is a more recent creation. The Lord Mayor is more of a ceremonial post for the Square Mile, which is the oldest part of London, best known today as the main financial area. In A Christmas Carol, Dickens portrays this landmark as being in stark contrast to the miserable atmosphere in Scrooge's counting house. In the stronghold of the mighty mansion house, he tells us, the Lord Mayor gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should. Once Scrooge finally decides to close business for the day, Dickens tells us that the miser took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. The exact name of the tavern isn't given. However, going by what we know about Scrooge's office being in the vicinity of Cornhill, there are two strong contenders for Scrooge's local. The first is Simpson's Tavern, which is tucked away up an alley called Bull Court, and has been in business since 1757, so it was already over 80 years old when Dickens penned A Christmas Carol. Just around the corner is the George and Vulture. There has been an inn on this site since 1142, and the George and Vulture is mentioned many times in Dickens' first novel, The Pickwick Papers. Charles Dickens himself enjoyed drinking here, so perhaps this is more the place he had in mind. You'll also find the Jamaica Wine House in this area, which was built on the site of London's first coffee shop. However, this current building dates from the 1860s, so it wouldn't have existed in its current form when A Christmas Carol first appeared. Back out on Cornhill and just across from Newman's Court is another pub called the Counting House. This one's much more recent, although it's rather appropriately named considering the area's links with Ebenezer. Today, London's financial square mile is dominated by offices, meaning very few people live there. However, during the Victorian period it was far more common, and Scrooge lived very close to his place of work. His house, we're informed, was a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide and seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again. Amongst all of today's modern architecture, perhaps the best place to get a feel for the yard in which Scrooge may have lived is Brabant Court off of Philpot Lane. As for the location of Scrooge's home, a good contender is a spot off of Lime Street, the reason for which I'll explain more later. Ebenezer Scrooge's poorly paid clerk, Bob Cratchit, lives with his family, including the sickly Tiny Tim, in Camden Town, which, in the 1840s, was an area blighted by considerable poverty. The ghost of Christmas present takes Scrooge here to witness the Cratchits, who, despite living off of Bob's income of just 15 shillings a week, which is about £45 in today's money, do their utmost to enjoy the day. As a youngster, Charles Dickens himself spent time living in Camden, on Bayham Street to be precise, in the early 1820s. It doesn't require too much of a stretch of the imagination, therefore, to assume that he had Bayham Street in mind when envisioning the Cratchits' modest home. Although not associated with Dickens' original text in the sense that the other locations in this video are, there is another Christmas Carol link in Camden which really deserves a mention. Head up Camden High Street, cut across Jamestown Road, and you'll find Oval Road. Here, beside the canal, is an apartment block called the Henson, which has been converted from former railway offices. The Henson is named in honour of the late Jim Henson, the American creator of the Muppets, for this old site was once home to Jim Henson's Creature Workshop, a studio where many Muppets were lovingly created. And yes, that includes ones used in one of the most beloved and surprisingly accurate interpretations of Dickens' story, The Muppets' Christmas Carol, which was released in 1992, 2 years after Jim Henson's sudden death at the age of just 53. The film itself, which stars the legendary Sir Michael Caine as Scrooge, was shot at Shepperton Studios on the southwestern outskirts of London. The Creature Workshop in Camden remained in use until 1995. We now return to London's financial square mile. Dominating the eastern side of Bank Junction is the Royal Exchange, an institution dating back to the 16th century. It was founded by Sir Thomas Gresham, who recognised the need for an official centre of commerce in the city of London. He was inspired by a similar building in Antwerp. There have been several Royal Exchange buildings on this site over the centuries. The one we see today opened in the early 1840s, and was therefore pretty much brand new at around the time Dickens was writing A Christmas Carol. Although the Royal Exchange is now occupied by a luxury shopping mall, it was still very much a place of business in Dickens' time, and as such Scrooge, who, as we've seen earlier, worked very close by in the vicinity of Cornhill, would have been a regular here, often popping by to discuss business. In the 19th century, the Royal Exchange was often referred to simply as Change, and this shortened name appears in the very opening lines to A Christmas Carol. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Even more significantly, the Royal Exchange is one of the places to which the third, and most terrifying of all the spirits, the ghost of Christmas yet to come, takes Scrooge. Here, the voiceless phantom forces the miser to watch his business acquaintances as they blithely discuss his death. There they were, in the heart of it, on change amongst the merchants who hurried up and down and chinked their money in their pockets and conversed in groups and looked at their watches and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing the hand that pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. I don't know much of it. Either way, I only know he's dead. The group then proceed to joke about Scrooge's funeral, with one fellow saying that it's likely to be a very cheap funeral, for upon my life, I don't know of anybody to go to it. Following his ordeal with the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, Scrooge has become a changed man. Full of joy, he throws open the windows, allowing the glorious morning light to shine through. It's at this point that Scrooge calls to a passing boy to inquire what day it is, to which the lad famously replies, "Today? What, Christmas Day?" Scrooge then goes on to ask the boy if he knows the poulterer's in the next street but one at the corner, where a priced turkey has been on display, as he wishes to purchase it for Bob Cratchit's family. In the 1840s, the best place to buy a Christmas bird in London would have been Leadenhall Market, which is located in the heart of the city, very close to Cornhill, the Royal Exchange, and the Mansion House. As I mentioned earlier, a likely contender for the location of Scrooge's home is somewhere around Lime Street, the reason being that it is connected to Leadenhall Market by two short lanes, Lime Street Passage and Leadenhall Place. As Scrooge says, the poultry shop is in the next street but one. Going slightly off tangent for a moment, another Christmas tale connected with Leadenhall Market is the true story of Old Tom. Old Tom was a goose, who, shortly before the Christmas of 1797, was brought along with thousands of other geese to Leadenhall Market for slaughter. However, moments before he was due to receive the chop, Tom made a break for freedom and proceeded to run and flap around the market for the next couple of days, skillfully avoiding capture. As such, the market traders at Leadenhall decided to grant Tom a reprieve, and he was adopted as a pet and mascot. Tom made the market his home, and no doubt grew rather tubby on the many scraps which those working at Leadenhall gave him. He finally passed away in 1835, just a few years before A Christmas Carol was published. He was 37 years old, so not bad for a gander. He even had his obituary printed in the Times, and he's now buried somewhere beneath the site. In Leadenhall Market today, there's a bar called Old Tom's, in honour of this extraordinary bird. As we saw a moment ago, though, Scrooge opted for a turkey rather than a goose. Once the boy brings Scrooge the turkey, the now reformed miser exclaims, "Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town. You must have a cab," which he obligingly pays for, another sign that he's abandoned his thrifty ways. In the Victorian era, hackney cabs were of course horse-drawn, although they remained a feature well into the 20th century. This clip from 1960 shows a cabbie named Fred Jones, who began his career driving a horse-drawn cab. Meanwhile, Ebenezer Scrooge strives to make the most of his newfound festive joy, and finally makes it to his nephew Fred's for Christmas dinner. Charles Dickens wraps up A Christmas Carol by telling us that Scrooge became as good as a man as the good old city knew. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of sites associated with A Christmas Carol. As we've seen from various clips shown here, many actors have portrayed Ebenezer Scrooge over the years. Who's your favourite Scrooge? Let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel so that you don't miss out on any future content. Likes and shares are also very much appreciated, as they will help this channel grow. If in the meantime you'd like to discover more London history and info, why not head over to my website, robslondon.com. Or if you're after a special gift, check out my Etsy store, Rob's Online Designs, where you'll find an array of London themed merchandise. Links are all in the description. Thanks again, have a wonderful Christmas and the best of luck for the new year.